that we can post this for later. So welcome back, everyone. Thank you for the quick turnaround. Our next learning session after this is not for about 6 weeks, so you'll get a little bit of a break from us, at least from in-person online meetings. If you want to go ahead and use the chat box to introduce yourself to everyone else on the call, that would be great. And just a quick reminder to mute your phone when you're not speaking. Quick disclaimers, and the session's being recorded, and the recording of the session will be posted on the participants only website. Our welcome session and the slides from that are already located here. If you just click on this link, the password is PEDS Disaster Ready. And quick acknowledgements and disclaimer, our funding sources. So the Eastern Great Lakes Pediatric Consortium for Disaster Response is funded by the U.S. Health and Human Services Office of the Assistant Secretary of Preparedness and Response, ASPR, totaling $6 million to pilot the creation of pediatric disaster care centers of excellence to improve disaster response capabilities for children in the United States. Similarly, the EIC is supported by the Health Resources Service Administration of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services as part of the Emergency Medical Services for Children Innovation and Improvement Center Cooperative Agreement, totaling $1.5 million with 0% finance from non-governmental sources. The content presented here and throughout the collaborative is that of the authors. It does not necessarily represent the official views of, nor an endorsement by ASPR, HRSA, HHS, or the US government. So today you're going to hear from myself. I'm a senior project manager with the EMSC Innovation and Improvement Center, as well as Brent Kasny. Brent, you want to give a quick hello? I think most people heard you and Pat at the beginning, but if you want to do a quick introduction.
Yeah, sure. Hey guys, I'm Brent Kasny. I'm a Peds Emergency Medicine Doc at Texas Children's Baylor College of Medicine. I also serve as the Medical Director of Emergency Management at Texas Children's. And I'm one of the directors of the Disaster Preparedness domain of the EMS for Children Innovation and Improvement Center. Welcome, guys.
Awesome. Thanks, Brent. So a quick agenda for today. We're going to run through the results of the environmental scan, talk about the aggregate score, some common strengths and areas for improvement. And then we'll review our first module, which is the Pediatric Champion. We'll do some definitions, go through the roles and different change strategies for how you can improve in this area at your hospital. And then Brent's going to take you through how to kind of critically evaluate your current disaster plan and drill history for pediatric inclusion. How to identify gaps and sort of make the case for a pediatric inclusion. We'll walk you through the upcoming tabletop exercises. These are still maybe about 4 to 6 weeks away, but we want you to start thinking about them because you're gonna have to start getting it on everyone's schedule. And hopefully after we get through all that, we will have plenty of time at the end for discussion and questions. So I guess before I launch into the environmental scan, is there any outstanding questions or issues or any questions that anyone has? No? Okay. Oh. Anyone? No. Okay. So the environmental scan. So first, a few words about this scoring. This is a baseline. So I don't think any of us would be participating in the Quality Improvement Collaborative if we didn't see that there was room to improve. So take your score with a grain of salt. We can only really improve from here. It's really just to measure. It's simply a way to measure our progress through this collaborative. It's not intended to be a robust assessment of your hospital's disaster preparedness or really even a comprehensive measure of your hospital's ability to receive and treat children in a disaster. We're working on that. That is coming. And we'll talk a little bit in a few slides about the National Pediatric Readiness Project and how you can go and take this assessment and you'll get a validated PEDS Ready score and a gap analysis for how you can improve pediatric readiness at your hospital. This is not this. This is simply just a way to measure our progress and get an idea of where everyone's at, identify common gaps, and see how we can progress through the collaborative. So that being said, we had a total of 19 responses. My caveat being, if you finished it either about after 3 o'clock Central Time yesterday, I don't have your responses included in this average yet because we didn't have time to score all those ones. But there was a total possible 44 points. And the scoring was really simple, you guys. It was basically if you had a yes, and I published the scoring matrix on the website, so you can go here along with the full results. I'm just going to go through the highlights today on the participant-only webpage if you want to learn more about how we scored it. But it was basically a yes is 1 point, a no or an unsure is 0 points. And, straightforward from there. You know, if you had a pediatric triage tool, any of them that we listed, you got 1 point. If not, you got 0. So pretty straightforward, pretty simple. The collaborative average was 25 points or 58%, which is great. We have lots of room for improvement, and I think that's fantastic. Some of the highlights, almost all had a formal disaster plan, which I think, given sort of the recent events and everyone's awareness of their hospital disaster plan, this is maybe not surprising that everyone has a formal disaster plan. The top hazards in order were tornado, winter storm, infectious pandemic, information security or communications failure, and finally, workplace violence or a violent patient. So common areas of top hazards, almost all have a disaster preparedness committee. Again, not surprising. What we were encouraged to see is that a slight majority have pediatric representation on this committee. And most of these committees, someone on the committee has formal training in pediatric care, almost 87.5%. However, that person does not tend to carry a formal title or authority related to pediatric disaster coordination. And so this is kind of a good area for improvement. We'll talk about that in a little bit as far as change strategies. But more just kind of a brief summary of the environmental scan results, common strengths. Most of the ED staff are trained on the disaster protocol in multiple ways. So, you know, during staff orientation and then yearly exercises or drills and some other ways. A lot of you have a process in place to decontaminate pediatric patients. And we have a question on that in 1 second, which is why that asterisk is there. Most have adopted a pediatric triage tool, and most have criteria for and a defined mode of transport for interfacility transfer of pediatric patients. All of you are conducting drills quite frequently, which is fantastic, and most participate in a regional disaster coalition already. And so one question that we had from one of our participants, and you can either speak or use the chat box, whatever you feel most comfortable with, is what does your decontamination setup look like? You know, do you use a pop-up tent versus permanent showers? And what are the hospitals with cold weather doing to protect children from the elements during decontamination? And I think, I don't know, Brent, you probably have some suggestions here that maybe could kick us off with.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to hear from the group some of the answers to some of these questions. I think obviously this is very geographically dependent based on what weather is like in your areas. And what we tend to see, I think ideally, is that decontamination setups in places that are prone to cold weather have more of a permanent or at least covered and or heated area where they can perform decontamination. You know, down here in Texas, we have the opposite problem with heat. We have pop-up tents outside of our facilities and then have tried to facilitate keeping things cool primarily for the decontamination team by using strategies like cooling vests and other techniques to keep them comfortable and cool with frequent health checks during those events and drills as well.
Awesome, thanks, Brent. Anyone else want to comment on sort of their decontamination setup?
This is Mark Van Dyke from Helen DeVal Children's Hospital. We have a fixed shower with 2 shower heads, which serves plenty for 99% of our incidents. We do have an adult facility based on the same campus that also has an additional 5 shower heads and a fixed facility And then the adult ambulance bay turns into a full decon situation. We have heat lamps above that area to keep it warm.
Great, thank you. Anyone else? Looks like Eliza's
So good morning, good afternoon. I'm David. I'm from Beverly, Massachusetts, and we have our fair share of cold weather as well. We do have one internal shower that we would use in cold weather if we had a large number of patients to decontaminate. Otherwise, we use a pop-up, and everything's heated. The entry into the tent, we have 3 tents set up. The center tent is actually the decon portion. So everything's heated, and we try to keep it the temperature warm as well. So, I mean, we've done a few in decon in the wintertime. Obviously, it's impossible to keep it, 82 degrees, but we do the best we can.
Awesome, thank you. So yeah, I guess we'll keep moving forward, but if you have any more suggestions, please use the chat box. And this is a really great example, you guys, of how we want this collaborative to work. If you have something your hospital wants to work on, or you have a question, you send it to me and we can get the group to sort of address it in one of these learning sessions, or I can put it out to the group in an email. But this is really, the collaborative nature of this project, is to really kind of see what everyone's doing and how can we learn collectively together. So thank you all for that.
Hey, Meredith, this is Pat. I just was curious if anybody in the collaborative is partnering with their fire departments, or has some of the support for running the decon, through a service. Because it'd be difficult to get an initial response, but I have heard of facilities partnering with their fire departments around some of this issue.
Hey, it's Mark Van Dyke from Helen of Children's in Grand Rapids. We have had many discussions with our fire department about that topic, and on the onset it seemed like a really good idea, but what we have found is that the fire departments in our area do a very gross decon where all they're doing is spraying water on patients, and maybe, keyword being maybe, removing clothing if they're able to protect the patient's privacy afterwards. So what we have found was that the level of decon that's occurring in the field is not the level of decon that we feel comfortable with bringing them into the environment with closer contact with healthcare workers and obviously many other hazards as well. So while on the onset it seemed like a good idea for us to partner with somebody, we found that running our own decon program with secondary decon and training our own staff actually is better for the patients and for our staff from a safety perspective.
Yeah, I've actually heard of that being the concern as well. I don't know that, Brent, do you know if there's been any specific studies that have looked at, safety or decon effectiveness, in terms of what's happening in the field and then coming into the hospital? Because sometimes that's an area of controversy, that, whether to decon someone twice, or is it pretty common that everybody has to be deconned again, even if they have been deconned in the field?
Yeah, Pat, I think there's such great variability across the country as far as the degree of decontamination that occurs in the field based on local resources, the fire department, et cetera, that it's hard to standardize things. So I think what the previous speaker's point was about them, I think the key is recognizing what your local fire and hazmat team would be doing so that kind of the status that patients would likely arrive in. and developing that relationship so that you have that information handy is important.
I think that's a great recommendation, because the challenge is with decon how to scale it, and especially for a large number of patients, and you know what you should do. And this comes up not only in terms of chemical but also radiological you know, events.
And I think it's also important to remember that the best decon is done by the patient or the people they are with. And oftentimes in pediatrics, we're talking about people who are most likely arriving with an adult or a patient or a parent. And, you know, especially in the adult world and the pediatric world, you know, decontamination is not a hard thing to do. Most of us probably decon this morning, maybe a little less because many of us are working from home. But, you know, when we talk about decon, the majority of decon happens far away from fire departments and EMS. It happens in the home or in the workplace with 1 to 2 patients at a time. And so oftentimes the response from a third party may be inhibit medical care that would be brought in faster if we were to be able to train our own staff and how to talk people through self-decon.
Yeah, that's a great comment. I would agree with that, but I don't know that everybody feels or is comfortable, you know, saying those things or teaching those things.
Yeah, you know, this is a really great conversation, and if we have time at the end, let's come back to it. But let's make sure we have some time to kind of get through the material today. And then, or we can continue in the chat box, but I'll go ahead and move forward with sort of the results, if that's all right. But thank you all, those are all really great comments. So common areas for improvement from the environmental scan results. Getting the pediatric representative on the disaster committee to have a formal title or some sort of authority to implement these changes. The second most common was having a tool or a process for calculating ED pediatric surge capacity. Along the same lines, a pediatric tracking tool for unaccompanied children. We could also improve with the percentage of children live or simulated represented or participating in drills. And then determination of pediatric surge capacity at the regional coalition level, which we won't touch on much today as we talk about that sort of in our next set of modules, engaging with the regional coalition, but some great areas for improvement. And also from the little text box on what you all were most interested in learning. Most commonly, it was patient tracking and reunification, which is great because that is our final set of modules. We're going to spend about 6 weeks on how to do this really well here towards the end of the collaborative. Second was how do you best do staff education and training, which we will, try to come up with some resources for y'all on how to best do that. And I'll point you to some resources that already exist. Care for children in use of special health care needs, pediatric surge plan, and then psychological first aid for both patients and responders. So before I kind of launch into module 1 on the Pediatric Champion, is there any questions or comments on the environmental scan? Okay. Well, we'll launch into our first module and give you kind of overview of what we're going to be doing for the next 2 weeks. So the turnaround from here going forward is not going to be as quick. You're going to have 2 weeks to work on each module. And as I said in our welcome session, do what you can. There's going to be a lot of information here and a lot of ways you can improve, and you don't necessarily have to try to do it all. But just some general suggestions on ways you can improve as far as the Pediatric Champion. So broadly defined, a Pediatric Champion can also be known as a Pediatric Emergency Care Coordinator or a PEC. I'm sure many of you have heard that term before. I know quite a few of you indicated in your application that you did have a PEC at your hospital. And so this can be any individual, a physician, a nurse, or other healthcare staff member that has a desire to improve pediatric emergency care at their institution. It's pretty broadly defined. If you want to learn more about how, the Pediatric Champion is defined, you can see this 2018 Joint Policy Statement on Pediatric Readiness in the Emergency Department, which was put forth by the AAP, ACEP, and ENA, along with members from the EIC. So sort of the general roles and responsibilities of a pediatric champion is really to ensure the availability of essential pediatric supplies and equipment. And I will send a link to you. It's also on the IEC page. We have a great checklist available as part of the National Pediatric Readiness Project here under this Pediatric Readiness Toolkit, where you can go through your ED and see if you have the essential supplies and equipment for the care of pediatric patients. The second responsibility of the staff are that they're adequately trained on, or the pediatric champion is to ensure staff is adequately trained on the use of equipment in line with the emergency care and resuscitation of infants and children. Also to ensure ED policies and procedures consider the needs of children of all ages. And finally, number 4 is to facilitate the integration of pediatric needs in hospital disaster or emergency preparedness plans and promoting the inclusion of pediatric patients in disaster drills. So to learn more about the Pediatric Champion in general, our National Pediatric Readiness Project, is a link right here, is completely devoted to the Pediatric Champion, and we have a toolkit to support the Pediatric Champion in several different areas on how you can improve resources, all right here under this link. But more specifically, what the Pediatric Champion ideally will do as far as disaster coordination is to work in concert with the hospital emergency manager to integrate pediatric specific considerations within the hazard vulnerability analysis and planning goals. You can help plan and coordinate disaster drills that include pediatric patients, serve as a liaison for pediatric patients and concerns on other hospital committees, medical trauma, to assure that pediatric considerations and priorities are included in staff education and training, and pediatric considerations and priorities are included in disaster education for the pre-hospital providers. Assist with, and this can be any and all of these, so assist with the development and review of hospital policies, serve as a liaison to children and regional facilities, EMS agencies, and we're going to build more on this one here and the next one on the regional coalition building modules. Collaborate with the program manager and promote pediatric disaster awareness in the community. And I see sort of the conversation going here as far as are there hospitals present here that aren't children's hospitals? So the answer is yes, which is why we're kind of trying to hit this from all aspects. But when we think about a pediatric champion at a children's hospital, it's kind of a misnomer, right? I mean, you would think that they are all technically pediatric champions at a children's hospital. And so the way we want to think of sort of the PEC or the pediatric champion at a children's hospital or a hospital that sees primarily children or has a large volume of pediatric patients is really the disaster champion. And so to kind of, this person should maybe serve more as a clinical leader with disaster expertise. So it's sort of the medical director of emergency management. And so their roles and responsibilities are going to be similar to a pediatric champion, promoting staff education, serving on other hospital committees. And I think I'll let Brent talk a little bit about sort of his experience when he came to Texas Children's Hospital and integrating sort of this disaster champion role into their hospital disaster committee.
Yeah, Meredith, I think, the key, and again, we're trying to kind of tailor this to both the children's hospital and the non-children's hospitals, as we have both as part of the collaborative. But I think the key is thinking about it, like if you look at the data from the National PEDS Readiness Project, what we saw was that the presence of a PEC in these, non-children's hospitals was kind of the single most thing that led to improved readiness for taking care of children in these kind of day-to-day scenarios, these kind of so-called disaster of one patients that arrive in our community emergency departments, rural emergency departments, and non-pediatric hospitals. my guess and my thought about it is if you looked at children's hospitals and you tried to identify those that were best prepared from a disaster perspective, you would find that if they had a strong clinical voice that was a disaster champion, you would see a similar kind of thing outlined there, and you'd see similar improvement in disaster preparedness at those institutions. And so that's why I think specifically for the children's hospitals, having someone that's identified as kind of a disaster champion is an important piece to this puzzle. And I think one of the things that, you know, I recognized upon coming back to Texas Children's after I completed fellowship was that, you know, there were kind of people that were interested in disaster medicine. There were kind of people that when things happened, they got called upon to be engaged and involved. By and large, those were individuals that were integrated into things like EMS and other things that kind of lend themselves nicely to working in this space and from an operations standpoint and perspective. But there was really no solidified role of a clinical leader or physician or nurse leader that was kind of dedicated to improving their own expertise in disaster medicine, but as kind of a, you know, as a natural progression of that exercise leading to improved institutional preparedness. And so, you know, I think that's one of the things that we recognized in the environmental scan for you all is that by and large, there seem to be people that are interested or involved in this, but a lot of them don't have sort of a formal title. And I think what in my personal experience, what I've recognized is that, you know, unfortunately, a title goes a long way in adding and lending authority to an individual's position and maintaining that position. And we see so much of the time high rates of turnover at institutions, and having a formal position will make it where that one person who's kind of the disaster person, when they go on to another job or something else, that role is vacated and it has been created as a formal role, you know, you'll reach out and try to find somebody to fill that role. And so I do think it's a really important thing to focus on while you're kind of working through this first module is having some sort of formal position or title. And whatever works within your institution, I think, you know, works. It wasn't like when I first came back to Texas Children's, I was the medical director of emergency management. I was the physician lead of the emergency management committee, but was really kind of serving the role as medical director. And that position had not been yet created or formalized. And over the course of my involvement with a variety of responses, it was recognized as an important role to create. And that's kind of where we ended up. So I think, again, titles are important. Having formal job positions and job descriptions are important to kind of continue to push this agenda despite turnover and other challenges that occur at institutions.
Awesome. Thanks, Brent. Any questions for Brent? Good.
Yeah, this is Luis Pinapelta from Maryland. Hello, everybody. I think I would just want to kind of piggyback on that idea and add, it's also important to have not only, you know, your title and your roles, but to have the right time carved out for the activities. Not for this to be something that you add to somebody's, you know, FTE's responsibilities beyond what they regularly do. Because I think that's something that I see in our hospitals here in one of our regions in Maryland, that people really want to engage and become involved and take on leadership roles, but they are not given the time. They're given the title and they're given the responsibility and they're given the job description, but they just don't have the time. And so they really have to struggle between, you know, juggle all the things they have to do. And then they have this as a burden to their jobs more than an opportunity for them to get involved and make a contribution.
Yeah, I agree 100%. I think it's sometimes when you talk about time, and you know, time comes with funding, and so that sometimes can be a challenge. But I think what we'll hopefully do is share some change strategies to lead ultimately to that. You know, the ultimate goal I think would be to have individuals with not just this formal title and job description, but also allocated time to do the work. 100% agree with your statements.
Yeah. And I see your comment, Mike, how do we create this pediatric disaster champion? And that's a great segue. So let's move forward and really sort of how do you create this position? How do you make the case for it? And, I think on the surface, peds is not a hard sell, even if you see primarily adults. Like, hospital leaders and CEOs intuitively know that this, it's important. We all are probably parents, and it's not, I think, on the surface a hard sell that we need to consider kids and do what's best for them. But there's some certain ways to do that because of sort of competing priorities. And so how do you, and we're going to talk through kind of the different ways you can gain support at the C-suite level, among ED leaders and then ultimately the bedside staff. And so, under here we have a few bullet points on sort of kind of what their main priorities typically tend to be. So with the C-suite, they're thinking about the public reputation and their market share and what's the return on investment. ED leaders have, so many competing interests, staff training versus the patient need, and is there issues around patient safety or staff resources? And then your bedside staff, it seems like there's a different initiative of the month, and is there a perceived need for improvements? And ultimately, who are the local experts that they can trust to really educate them on how to do this well? And so making the case on that, why should we work on this? Why should we improve pediatric disaster care? And it's a balance between, sort of, is it good enough for now? We don't have specific complaints. There's a bunch of competing initiatives, not a lot of evidence to suggest we need to improve, and limited resources. But on the other hand, you have sort of the community feedback, market share. Are there more peds, and where hospitals are they going to? And really sort of the tangible benefits of peds readiness work in disaster and across the board. And of course, we have COVID-19 here, who has its thumb on the scale a little bit this side, which kind of makes the timing right now to start thinking about incorporating peds into your disaster plan right now. And so how do you make the case that you need to improve here? And so you can make the clinical case, can you review charts and, has there been maybe safety issues around, treating of a single peds patient, and is it reasonable to assume that those issues aren't going to manifest themselves greater if you have a sort of disaster event that involves children? How does the hospital care team feel about treating children? Are they comfortable taking a blood pressure on an infant? And getting sort of these kind of anecdotal responses from the clinical staff, or even putting together some sort of formal survey that you can take to the hospital leadership to say, look, and in our experience with the Pediatric Readiness Quality Collaborative, this was very effective. If the staff doesn't feel comfortable treating patients, hospital leadership tends to be pretty responsive to that. You can also, appeal to sort of what does the market look like in your area? Are there a lot of peds patients? Is there a huge potential to see a lot of peds patients in the event of a disaster? And can perhaps your hospital use their work in improving their pediatric disaster readiness in sort of a marketing campaign? And then for our children's hospitals, it's, some have seen this as sort of their parent hospital responsibility. And so do you have, can you do, as a children's hospital, is it your responsibility? And this came primarily from one of our children's hospitals down here in Texas that, sort of designated as outreach directors. They had an MD and an RN that were responsible for working with hospitals within their network to help them improve their peds readiness in certain areas. And so they committed to providing supplies, or had a supply exchange program where hospitals who didn't see as many peds patients could exchange supplies that were about to expire with the children's hospital. And then working with them to kind of do on-site improvement plans. We also put together a tip sheet and talking points that is posted to our participants only website. Password again, Peds Disaster Ready, so that if you want to start to kind of make the case for forming this role, that we have some tips on how to do that on the website too. So for module 1, what do we want you to do? So the purpose of this first module is going to be really collect the information. So Now on the red cap form, there's not going to be an option for unsure. We want you to go find the answers. So that's really engaging with the emergency manager or your emergency management committee. Or, some of you are one and the same on this call. So really kind of self-analyzing, is there pediatric expertise on the committee? And if not, why? And what do we need to do to improve here? And the module packet will come out tomorrow morning, but these are some of the change strategies that you can work through at your institution to improve through this module. And really, and I put it in red and bolded it. And the first one is, do you have a pediatric or disaster champion? Yes or no? And that's sort of the primary goal of this module, is to get a pediatric champion identified. Most of you have. And so if you do, are his or her responsibilities, and I'm going to add here, time carved out. Are they defined? If not, define the roles and responsibility. Does he or she have any, formal training in pediatric disaster preparedness? For instance, have they done the FEMA 439 course? Yes or no? And then moving down to, do you have an official title or an authority given to this person to do this role? If not, work with leadership to formalize the role. And then is the care team adequately trained on pediatric needs? And if not, maybe develop a staff education plan. And I think, before we launch into the next module, any questions on module 1 or what we want you to do, or the idea here behind our first module? Okay, well, if you have any more questions, you can always reach me by email, or you're welcome to use the chat box. But I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Brent to talk about sort of our next 2 modules, because we won't get together on a phone call before the second and third modules. So we kind of want to walk you through how to evaluate your current plan and drill history. So you can take it away, Brent.
Great. So if when in this next, module, what we're going to be doing is having people kind of take a deep dive into their current hospital plans for disaster readiness or preparedness. And, I think, unfortunately, it's kind of this double-edged sword of having joint commission requirements mean things get done, but sometimes they only get done for the sake of the joint commission, as opposed to being anything that's a truly usable document. So what we really want people to do are look at their hospital disaster plans and see, ideally, if they're really usable documents. We've, even here at Texas Children's, we'll see kind of these red binders that are up on the walls around the hospital that, if you grab it and look at it in the midst of an incoming disaster or in the midst of a disaster, you'll see like, oh, this isn't really very helpful. Like, it's not something that's very usable for the end users. And so looking at those documents, those plans, and seeing if they make sense from a beyond just checking a box of a joint commission requirement, I think is really important. And looking at that from a perspective of something that's truly usable. So the first thing is you're going to have a plan, and that's what we saw, is that most people said there is a plan, but it's really looking at that joint commission plan and seeing if it's something that goes beyond just joint commission requirements, but it's something that's really usable, that can be used by the end user as a user-friendly document that would be of assistance in disaster. Then the next step is really going to be looking at that and identifying if there are certain specific pediatric considerations integrated into it. And what we saw is that there seems to be, the group seems to have an interest specifically with regards to family reunification, patient tracking, as well as pediatric surge planning. So kind of all the 3 of the things that I put in this box seem to be keys and highlights that you guys realized are things that you'd like to improve upon and work on. So it's good to know. And so it's looking at that plan and seeing what is in place. And I think one of the things that becomes a challenge with some of this is that people think they kind of need to reinvent the wheel. But the reality of it is, and I'll use unaccompanied minors as an example, that you likely have a plan in place, and it might not be embedded in your disaster plan, but you likely have a plan in place as far as what to do with an unaccompanied minor that presents to your institution. This is something that we obviously at children's hospitals can see with increased frequency, but even in community hospitals and non-children's hospitals, there are oftentimes children that arrive on the doorstep without parents or without legal guardians. And so you likely have a plan in place, but the question is there an interconnect between that plan that may be owned by social work or security or what have you, and emergency management. So it's kind of tying all of these pieces together. And then looking specifically at things like family reunification, patient tracking, and surge planning, and seeing if there's any consideration for those in those plans. So that's going to be, I think, the third kind of checking the box, so to speak, as you kind of do a deeper dive into your plan and identify what gaps may exist. And we're going to give you guys some resources that will hopefully be helpful in building out these, among other aspects specific to children in your disaster plans. The final thing for this module is really taking a close look at drilling and seeing to what degree children have been involved in drills historically at your institution, but also, do you think that you have a robust drilling program? One of the things that we see is that a lot of times, and again, from a Joint Commission or regulatory standpoint, drills are a requirement, but many times these drills are kind of begin and end in the emergency center. So from a personal and anecdotal perspective, I can tell you when I came back to Texas Children's, we did disaster drills annually. They largely consisted of yardsticks or balloons getting brought into the emergency room with vital sign cards on them. And the emergency center staff assessed the triage cards, triaged the patients, and by patients, I mean yardsticks or balloons, put them in rooms. There was some patient care kind of outlined, a patient care plan outlined, and that was really the end of the exercise. But really thinking about and integrating all aspects of the hospital that would really be a part of the hospital's response to these events, I think is paramount. And we'll talk about that next, but also, are you really involving kids in your drills? And when we say involving kids, it's not, I think even Texas Children's, we fall victim to this, would be having, we've got 10 kids, but they're all like 17-year-olds that go to a nearby high school that are participating in the drill. And obviously there's been some guidance from the AAP and others as far as how to do this in a safe fashion for children, not expose them to any unnecessary, mental trauma, but to do it safely in a way that you can recognize and identify some of the gaps in planning that exist when you actually have, children in your emergency center and some of the challenges that come as a result of that. I kind of make the parallel to what we say, when we talk about decon drilling, which is like, you really need to run the water through the tent. Like, you really need to turn the water on, is a key principle when you talk about decon drilling, because what we see is, if you don't turn the water on, when you do finally in a real event, you're going to see you've got leaks everywhere. And it's just like having kids as part of your drills, where you're going to recognize there's the increased need for staff because you've got smaller age kids that need somebody watching them, someone staying with them the entire time, someone keeping them safe. These are the sort of things and gaps that you'll identify within your system and current plan if you actually involve children in these drills. And next, for Module 3, from August 12th to 25th, we're going to be, conducting tabletop exercises. And this is kind of builds upon that previous piece, looking at what drills look like. This is a picture from a tabletop drill that we did at Texas Children's a couple of years ago that was radiology specific. So we extrapolated data from a mass casualty drill that we had done that involved the influx of 50 patients to our facility. That was an in situ drill with 50 kids coming into the institution. And we took all the data, number of chest x-rays ordered, CT scans ordered, all of that stuff, the timing of those patient arrivals, and when those orders were placed. And then we said, could radiology actually pull off what we, in theory, simulated? And so we kind of condensed the timeline and used timers to see what the available staff is on a given day with radiology to do portable chest x-rays, what the throughput for patients through CT would be, et cetera, to identify what gaps and what challenges would arise in a real event. I think this just highlights the need to not just include those key clinical areas like the emergency center, which is again where I think things kind of begin and end a lot of the times, but all those clinical support areas. And the list is longer than these three, but these are three, three key places to highlight: radiology, lab, blood bank, pharmacy. All these people that would be mobilized if there was a strong influx of pediatric patients into your facility, but oftentimes are left out of not only the planning portion, but also the drilling portion of these plans. And then looking again, I think beyond these clinical support areas to other support personnel that really need to be activated in these events, like security, social work, media relations. The list could go on and on. And so when we do these tabletop exercises, what we're really trying to focus on is the development of kind of intra-facility coalition building. So we talk a lot about regional coalitions, but you really need to have a strong framework and relationship between all of these groups when responding to a true disaster, and that needs to be drilled upon to identify whatever barriers may exist to mobilizing these resources in a true event. On the next slide, what you'll see are the tabletop exercises that we have outlined as and this is a little sneak peek of the tabletop exercise module, where we have 6 scenarios, and we want to make it where these things are relatively relevant to anybody that could be participating, regardless of geography. Hence some of the variation there. But pick something that you think would be relevant to your community, relevant to your experience clinically, and these are kind of the scenarios that we hope you'll select one of these to do the tabletop exercise. And again, looking at who all those key players would need to be. And the reason we're mentioning this now is because we recognize that, scheduling is a challenge, especially in the era of COVID pandemic response and planning. And so what we really are hopeful for is that this is something you guys can get on the books and get on your calendars sooner rather than later to really have a robust plan in place to engage all of those member groups within your facility that would need to be involved.
Thanks, Brent. Just to keep on your radar, we're going to have you do an after action report after you do the tabletop exercise. This is what it's going to look like. This will be the red cap for this module, where you kind of go through the objectives, identify what you did well, where were areas of weakness, how can you improve, who's going to help you there. And there will be more detail about this in the module packet, but let me go back and show you the dates real quick so that you can start thinking about it. So it's not till the end of August, but like we said, we really want you to have more than just the ED involved, and so really try to start scheduling it now. Any questions about evaluating your plan, putting together the tabletop exercise, and what we want you to do over the next 6 weeks or so?
And again, the module packets will go into much greater detail, but we wanted to kind of give a little teaser, big picture overview of this kind of first phase of this project for everyone involved, so that you guys kind of know what you're, biting off from the onset.
Okay, well, we are also available by email and everything. Few housekeeping items. The next learning session is August 25th at 12 Eastern, 11 Central. We're going to start talking about regional disaster coalitions and really engaging pediatric readiness on that level. The modules will be emailed out every 2 weeks on Wednesday. So tomorrow, the module 1 will be sent out tomorrow morning. You can also find it on the participants only website. And a quick reminder, the participant contact list is, I'm going to publish it to the participants only webpage, just name and emails, institutions, tomorrow. So let me know, please, if you do not want your name and email listed, and I will keep it off. And also, once I have the list up, notify me if you would like anyone else included. Who I put on this list is who I have on my email list and who gets the meeting invite. So if you see someone else from your institution that should be included, please let me know. So with that, we have about 10 minutes for discussion and questions. We can return to decon. We can address maybe another question about pediatric disaster preparedness or any of the ins and outs. Any questions, anything we can touch on right now?
And Meredith, I just wanted to say kind of in closing before we field discussion or questions is, you know, one of the key, I think, benefits of participating in a collaborative like this is leaning on the experience of the other member groups that are going through the collaborative. And that's why I think the participant webpage is a great resource. And what we're really hoping is that, you know, we know that there are probably a number of you guys do some of these things very well. Hopefully, a lot of you guys don't do them all very well, because then we wouldn't be kind of helping much. But we know that there are clearly people out there that are participating, or institutions that are participating, that are likely, you know, good at some of this stuff. And so hopefully we can share best practices and everything as we move through this.
Yeah, great point, Britt.
I just wanted, this is Pat Frost. I just wanted to also, you know, collaboratives like this is really about us building a community and a network. And regardless of, you know, where you are on the scale between novice and expert, we are all learning together. Even the most, you know, I mean, Brent and I and all the people that we work with that have so much even more experience than we do have all come up this chain of, you know, learning. And so we really want this to work for you, and we really want you to network with both each other and not be afraid to ask questions and explore things and, you know, throw out ideas and also talk about challenges as far as that, because this is a process. And, you know, we're here to support you through your local process and your community process with this, because that's how we all get this stuff better.
Mm-hmm. All right, well, I guess if there's no specific questions or discussions we want to have, can give you some of your time back today. So like I said, module packets will come out tomorrow. Email me any questions, issues, items for discussion on later learning sessions. Like Pat said, we're here to support you. We're here to learn along with you. So thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, you guys.
Hey, Brent, take it easy.
What was that?
I said, take it easy. I look forward to hearing from you. Are you going to be available for the next regional metrics meeting?